speaker. Make sure I hit record. Sorry. Yes. Okay, so today we're going to be learning about what's on my ballot and why we're already voting. And I would like to introduce Melissa Kenfield to you. Her interest in local politics started as a child when her mother forced her to hold political signs in a contentious state house race. Her career hasn't taken her into politics, rather she teaches sociology here at Connect. Melissa has worked as an election clerk in several elections, getting to see at the ground level how elections actually work. She was a board member of the League of Women Voters of Collin County from 2016 to 2020, and in that time assisted with a range of responsibilities in hosting and moderating candidate forums. She still loves local politics, where you can actually meet the candidates and have conversations about the issues, but you probably won't find her holding anybody's signs. So join me in welcoming Professor Melissa Kenfield, and thank you so much.
Hello. And let me make sure, I think I've spotlighted my video, so everybody has to look at me. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat, which if y'all want to follow along, that should be a Google Doc that any of y'all can access. And so I've built this kind of as a resource for y'all. There's going to be all kinds of clickable links in that document where you can find where I'm getting information from. And there's going to be a few things that I have interactive throughout the day. So hopefully we are all ready to engage with that. So thank you for the introduction, Joan. Hi, I'm Melissa Kenfield. And like she mentioned, I teach sociology, but I still have a soft spot for local politics. And so I'm very excited to help out and do this presentation. And I'll be covering a lot of what's going on our ballots this election cycle. So we're just going to roll into it. So the general topics are just a quick recap, like why are we voting already? What's going on with the primaries? And why is there so much on our ballot? And then I would like to talk a little bit about the different positions that are on the ballot. This is where I need y'all's interaction. I will be asking a few questions later on about which things on your ballots are you most interested in, because depending on where you live, there might be different positions up for election. And so we'll be covering that. And if I don't get to the topic you're most excited about, that's okay. We've got that document as a resource. So that's the general overview. And the first thing here is some of us are like, what's going on with elections already? Don't we usually do that in November? And isn't it usually just like the two main parties like fighting in November? And the thing that we're voting on right now is basically who's going to be on the ballot in November. I know I'm kind of in the way of the fighting image, but what happens is we pick in March who's going to be in the ballots later on in the year. So it's basically the party saying who's our best fighter, who's the person who can actually win the battle later in the year. Now, if this were this simple, we could just move on. But sometimes we don't pick the person quite yet. Sometimes what happens is there's not a clear winner in the primaries, and so we go to the runoffs. And I find the runoffs really interesting. So that would happen sometime late May, depending on the particular calendars of the year. And those races get really interesting and are often very tight, very close. The election I remember, like as a kid, that we were holding signs for, that was actually one where there were 4 people running for a state house race, and my mom was friends with one of them and really wanted this person to win. And so had the whole family holding signs and wearing the matching t-shirts. And that candidate got like 40% of the vote in the primary, but didn't win outright. And so the top 2 winners went to a runoff. And basically the people who had voted for the other candidate split 3 ways. They overwhelmingly piled on the other person. And so in the runoff, my mom's preferred candidate didn't make it. And the other person got elected to the state house and stayed in office for about 20 years. And that was decided in the runoffs. And so that's one of those things to keep an eye on. Now, I'm cutting out part of the political cycle because there's also third parties. There's also things like the Libertarian Party or the Green Party, and they have a different way of picking their candidates. They have conventions. And so that's one of those things that if you're really interested in third party politics, then you don't want to participate in the primaries, you have to wait until the conventions. So I wanted to give a shout out to the third parties and a little bit of a, we'll get back to them. We'll talk about them again in a few minutes. So that's the general overview. So it's the parties trying to pick the best candidate, and if there's not a clear winner, it'll go to a runoff. So now here's the part where I need y'all to help out a little bit. I'm going to be asking y'all which races you're most interested in. I'm dropping some links in the chat. What I need y'all to do is find your sample ballots. So there's a variety of resources online. Vote 411 is run by the League of Women Voters. And I've also listed Tarrant County votes because I assume most of y'all live in Tarrant County. And through either of those, you can find sample ballots, what's going on. So later on, I'm going to ask y'all, which of these races intrigues you? Which of these positions are you most interested in? If you want, y'all can jump to those links right now, but I don't want the people watching the video to just be bored. So I'm going to talk about a couple more things as y'all look through that. So one of these things is just a fun history check. We have so many things on our ballots, and I want us to ask ourselves, why does Texas love electing so many positions? There's a few of the positions that in other states, they're not elected positions. Some of them are just selected by somebody higher in power, like the governor appoints them or the county judge appoints them. Some of them are just hired positions, like through a traditional like human resources process where they have a hiring committee and they hire people. But Texas loves electing a lot of positions. And so I want us to ask ourselves, what's up with that? And now that we've chewed on that for a few seconds, I'll just give y'all a few things to think about on that. We do have these broad ideals of democracy. We love the thought that our votes have power. And one of the great things about it is it does put a lot of responsibility on us, on all of us to figure out what's going on in government and how do we engage with that. So it pushes a lot of responsibility back to the people. So even things like the people who are just keeping county records, like the records of marriage certificates and things like that, we keep up with our county clerks and our district clerks as elected positions so that we, the people, have a lot of ownership and responsibility. So that's kind of cool. It maintains a lot of accountability. But another thing about it is it can make it harder for the government to actually do things. And I ask this question, is this a feature or a bug? Some states have state legislatures that meet year-round, and Texas meets for what, a few months every other year, unless they're called back into special session. It seems that it was intentionally designed to have a shorter span of time so they had less opportunity to do things. And so that's one of those things that, ask your teachers who teach Texas history or Texas government to go on about some of that. And there's just so much interesting stuff going on that we've just maintained this as a Texas tradition, whereas in other states, you might find year-round. The judges is another one that I find very interesting. I've got another slide about the judges coming up in a minute, but Texas elects a lot of judges that in other states would be either selected through a committee of attorneys or appointed by your elected officials. And in Texas, we push that responsibility back onto the voters. So again, feature or bug, your call. Now, another level of analysis on this one, and again, I teach sociology, so I have to bring it in here. In sociology, we have a few different frameworks that we use to analyze society. And so there's this a functionalist analysis that focuses on how things developed in a society to keep it stable. So maybe our systems have developed because it maintains stability. How many times have we seen revolutions in world history related to people feeling like they don't have enough political power? So maybe that's a great way to look at our systems and say, hey, these systems have developed to keep us stable. But another way of looking at things is called a conflict analysis, which focuses on how those in power make the rules. Those in power are the ones who get to set how a person comes to power. And so what happens is the people who have the power to change electoral rules are the ones who were elected. And so when we look at the way that we have a pretty strong two-party system, and it's very hard to get elected outside of those two parties, well, that's in part because the funding rules are set and the structure of elections are set in such a way that it is very hard to break out of that two-party system. And why would they? Because they are the ones in power. So again, that's a couple of different ways of looking at it. But we're not here for the sociological analysis. We're primarily here to talk about what's on our ballot. So let's get back to that. There's my promised slide about judges. And again, I'm going to drop this link in the chat one more time so that you can follow all these different resources I post. I haven't kept an eye on how many people have come in since I last posted that link. But there's so many different courts. And again, if you haven't followed much about the court structure in Texas, you can feel like you're just getting thrown into the deep end of the pool. And there's a lot to keep an eye on. But I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of Texas courts. So enjoy this. That we've got a lot of like little local courts. So there's like justice courts or municipal courts like the Justice of the Peace. And there's so many of those across the state. Part of what makes it complicated is because we have huge variations in population and we have 254 counties. There are some things that in the smallest counties that only have a few hundred people, they might just have one set of courts. But in the larger counties, we'll have things that are like they'll have dozens of different specialized courts. So we've got county level courts, and there's say over 500 of those. There's district courts, 478 of those currently. That number keeps going up. And these have specialized functions if you're in a larger county. And then all of this flow chart is showing that if a ruling doesn't go well at a lower position, people can appeal, like you can appeal to a higher court. And so all of these are following the flow chart of who do you appeal to. And so from these district courts, you can appeal to a cleverly titled Court of Appeals. And so they have this intermediate jurisdiction. And then from there, we have this split thing going on where we have a Supreme Court of Texas and a Court of Criminal Appeals, which, fun fact, I think there's only 2 states in the country that split their highest court. I think it's just Texas and Oklahoma. I might need the government teachers to fact check me in the comments on this one. But generally, those are unified at the top. Yeah, so it's just us in Oklahoma who get to split it out, which again, the advantage is that there's more of this, people get to specialize, the justices on those courts get to specialize in either criminal or civil and constitutional issues. It also means we get to elect even more judges. So that's a lot. I've already put us through a lot of details. And I'm going to do one more, just big picture, admittedly terrible slide. Just buckle in, enjoy this one. There's so many different things that we elect. This is not meant to be readable. This is meant to be overwhelming, that we can elect like federal level, state level, all kinds of county positions. There's city and school district positions that we can elect, which are later on in the year. We'll talk about that in April. And then from that, some of these are the lawmaking, the legislative positions. Some of them are the judicial. Some of them are executive. Some of them are just these like administrative positions. So again, I totally get when people are overwhelmed, like there's so much on my ballot. That's okay. So now we're going to get into the meat of this. It is so cool that we get to be involved. I like to think of it as ourselves as a massive hiring committee, trying to pick the best people for the jobs. But it's also overwhelming. There's this thing called ballot fatigue, where there's just so many different things that we get to vote on. So I've given y'all a few minutes, again, looking over your sample ballots, and I'll put those links back in the chat again one more time. Are there specific positions that you noticed on your ballots that jumped out to you as, what is this? I'm curious about this. What do you want to learn more about? So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat on that one. I see typing. So as you all are typing, one more thing that I just wanted to highlight, there's so many different levels of government that it's important that we identify, the correct people to complain to or contact about problems. So one of these things is like, imagine I have problems with my sidewalk. Do you think the president of the country is going to do anything about my sidewalks? Probably not. Governor? Probably not. The people that would help on that is probably my city council. They're probably the ones who are most connected to fixing my sidewalk. Now, if you don't live in a city, that might be a county commissioner's thing. Depending on where you live, it might be a homeowners association thing. And it might be something that state representatives or state senators care about when it comes to tax policy, municipal funding, things like that. So again, we'd keep an eye on which people can help the most. Or school issues. There's problems with like your school district doesn't have enough money for books or technology. Who would I contact with that? And again, do I think that my US senator could help? A little bit, but not really. Again, a lot of these are far more local than we often first think. And so that is primarily a local school board. To an extent, like the State Board of Education is way over their heads, and they're mainly interested in picking the textbooks, but they also have a little bit of oversight of some of that. And then the state representatives and state senators do most of the funding. Okay, cool. I'm seeing some cool things popping up in the chat. And then the last example I have here is national immigration policy. I bring this one up because I went to a candidate forum for city council where the city council started debating, like the people running for city council started debating federal immigration policy. And it's just like, this is way over y'all's heads. Like, I care about, again, my sidewalks. I care about trash not getting picked up. Do I want my city council to care about federal immigration policy? Probably not. Again, that's a federal issue. So with that, I see some good questions about Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor. So we'll just roll into that. So for more information on that, and again, I've built this presentation as a resource so that all of y'all can go through, and when you download the PDF, you can click on various things and get to additional resources. So I've seen a couple of questions about the statewide positions. So the governor and lieutenant governor, I think a lot of us kind of like intuitively see like governor as the figurehead of the state. One of the things that always surprises me about the governor is how many additional responsibilities, like appointing a lot of people. When I was putting this together and saw the full list of positions that the governor just fills in various boards, I was like, wow, that guy has more power than I realized. The lieutenant governor is an interesting one, and that's another race that I'm intrigued by how many different people are running for, because his or her primary responsibility is to preside over the Texas Senate and keep that running, as well as appointing a lot of people to a range of offices. And that's something that, again, in a lot of states, it's more of a figurehead or takes the role of governor when the governor's out of state. But in Texas, they have a lot of power over the Texas Senate specifically. So one of those things where if you're intrigued by how the Texas Senate operates, keep an eye on Lieutenant Governor. So I've built these where you can follow the links and go to Ballotpedia and see more about the specific people running. One of the things that I don't want to get into a lot of detail today, but I accidentally will at times, is I don't want to get into like all the weeds of who's running and why, but I will talk a little bit about that on the Attorney General, because the Attorney General is a position that is the top law enforcement agency of Texas. One of the things that gets so interesting about the Attorney General is you will find that Attorney Generals often get involved in national level politics through getting involved with various lawsuits against the federal government. And so they'll write these briefs saying the position of Texas is this, or the position of California is this. And so what happens is the Attorney General, instead of just being law enforcement or providing legal services to government agencies, instead of it just being like within Texas, the Attorney General often has a significant role in like national politics. Now, for y'all who haven't been following politics much lately, the Attorney General race in Texas has probably attracted some of the biggest names in this race that the people running, at least I'm going to focus on the Republican side because the current Attorney General is a Republican. The people running are a former Texas Supreme Court Justice, a congressperson, person elected to U.S. Congress, the Texas Land Commissioner, and then the person who's been Attorney General for several years. So those are all pretty prominent positions and people very well known within Texas politics. I can say I've only met 2 of the 4 in this race so far, but again, there's a lot going on in that race. And so that's one thing to keep an eye on. Okay, other positions. I'm going to give a very quick scroll through sample ballots since, oh, I'm getting a little bit of audio. Okay, cool. That's better. So I'm going to go through my sample ballots real quick to show y'all a couple of things. So depending on what party you affiliate with, and I'm going to get back to that one in a minute as well, you may have more or less on your ballot. So where I live, a Democratic sample ballot looks like this, barely 1 page. And where I live, the Republican sample ballot looks like this. So over twice as many things to vote on. And so things like I mentioned, the Attorney General race, there's 4 options there. If you look on the Democratic side, you'll see 5 options, and of these, they are not nearly as prominent within state politics. So before I go on, because I haven't seen a ton of questions in the chat about specific positions yet, one of the things that I wanted to address as well is sometimes people ask me, how do I know which primary to vote in? This one, I'm going to get spicy whether I like it or not on this question. But one of these problems is Americans don't fit as neatly into like the 2-party system as most politicians would like us to believe. At least in my life, most people I encounter have a diversity of views and don't fit neatly into camps. And I've got an image here from the Pew Research Forum of political ideology where they break it out into a lot more categories and show that it's not as neat of a, this flag and faith conservatives, generally Republican, but there's a handful who are generally Democrat, or people that view themselves as the outsider left. Again, a few of them vote Republican, most of them vote Democrat. But there's this group of like stressed sideliners, people who are kind of in the middle of the political spectrum, and they swing either way. And so there's again, a lot of people in the middle who don't want to be in either camp. But one of the things that happens is the people with the strongest opinions are the ones most likely to show up in the primaries. And so if you ever feel like the sides are just getting further and further apart, and again, there's a ton more polling and public opinion on that one that I would love to get into some other day, that you tend to see the camps getting more and more separate. And so it leads us to this question of like, if I don't fit neatly into either, some people, you're politically active, what side on issues you generally are. Some people it's like no brainer, I know what primary I'm going to vote in. And if you're politically involved, and especially people involved in party politics, they really want you to vote in a particular primary because it has to do with identifying like how strong support for candidates is. If hardly anybody shows it up in a primary, they're like, well, why fund that race? They're never going to win, things like that. So people involved in party politics will tell you, vote for my team, end of story. The problem is some of us don't fit neatly into those camps. And a lot of these races are essentially decided in the primary because of the way that districts are drawn. Some of these races aren't contested at all. And so if I go to, again, the Democratic primary, there's a lot that are just not even like nobody is running. There's a lot where one person is running. So why vote in that one? Whereas there's a lot more going on the Republican primary. So that's one of those things to keep in mind. And then when you get to the runoff election, again, some of those runoffs get decided by literally dozens of votes. The former state representative where I live, she won in a runoff vote in the early 2000s that was decided by under 200 people. And so that's one of those things where, especially if you're watching close races, you might be more swayed towards that. So that's one of those things to keep in mind. So I'm going to go back to our big complicated slide. Again, I'm keeping an eye on the chat and I don't see anybody else picking specific races yet. So that sounds like y'all want me to go like free for all, just like talking about my favorite positions on the ballot. I don't see any objection to that. So a few of these that I find really interesting. The Railroad Commission, I love talking about. Railroad Commission, as the name suggests, regulates the oil and gas industry. So the Railroad Commission historically managed railroads, but in the past few years, pretty much all the responsibilities that have to do with railroads have been passed off to other agencies. And so we're left with this agency that, again, it is the primary responsibility of the Railroad Commission is to manage oil and gas industry. And there's this big question of why don't they change their name? So I'm going to show you all the two different sides of it. There's one side that says, well, if you cared about politics, you would look it up, you would learn these things. And so once you know it, you're like, okay, I'm going to remember it. Railroad Commission, oil and gas, got it. And so there's the side that says just get to know it, as well as there are so many legal documents that refer to the Railroad Commission that there is an argument among those who defend the name that says it would just take too much effort. It would risk some like really complicated federal things because of all of the different laws and policies that refer to the Railroad Commission. So there's like keep the status quo. The flip side to that is, and again, this is us putting on a bit of our analytical hat, there's this question of, whose interests are served by this being obscured a little bit? And so what happens is maybe people don't pay as much attention to the Railroad Commission as they should because they think it has to do with railroads. So there's that concern that they have a confusing name just so that people don't know what's going on. But that's something the state leg has tried to change their name a couple of times and it just never goes through. And it's also one of those issues that, I talk about it today. I have yet to see a person running for state legislature, whether it's the House or the Senate. I've yet to see somebody who campaigned on, I want to change the Railroad Commission's names. Maybe they're out there, but it's just not one of these issues that people get really excited by. That said, this organization is a big deal. This is something that has a lot of power in Texas. There's 3 people on this board, and they're elected every 6 years. And so you'll have one person elected this year, and then 2 years from now, the other seat will come up, and then 2 years after that, the other seat will come up. So that one will be staggered. So again, you can download my PDF and get all kinds of resources about what the Railroad Commission does in more detail. So that's one I find super interesting. Another one, again, I want to go back to the courts for a little bit. There are so many different courts, and it gets really interesting to see which of these races are contested. As I mentioned earlier, the courts get split out, that at the very top, there's a Court of Criminal Appeals and a Supreme Court of Texas. And one of the things on that one, again, they're 6-year terms. They're split out by specific needs. Most of the people who are on this court, but not all, served on a Court of Appeals district. And another thing that's very interesting about this one is very often people will step down partway through their term and then the replacement will get appointed by the governor. And so that's actually one of the ones going on right now, is a person who has not yet been elected to the Supreme Court, but was appointed by the governor. And so this candidate can run and say, hey, I've got experience, I'm on the court. They just haven't been elected there yet. Again, it's a 6-year term, and it's, again, pretty powerful position in the state of Texas. Most of the candidates, like I mentioned, came from a Court of Appeals district, but not all. The Court of Appeals districts, there's a lot of them across the state, big state, there's 14 districts. This one, I could not tell, I couldn't look up a Tarrant County sample ballot, so I'm not sure if y'all have any contested races. but I live in the 5th District Court because I'm over on the Collin County side. And I want to go back to the slide I had that showed a little bit of this tiny map that you may notice they split Dallas and Fort Worth into different districts. And so Fort Worth District has a lot of rural counties, and the Dallas District has, well, Dallas and Collin are both highly populated counties, but then they've pulled in a couple of the more rural counties. So that's another one that is worth keeping an eye on. Then there's all of these district judges. There are so many of them. It was, what was the number, 478? And again, most of these are not particularly contentious races, but they can get really interesting. This is a place where we have a cool amount of voter accountability. Some of y'all may remember a few years ago the infamous affluenza case, the person who was let off on a fairly light sentence. And I looked up what judge had sentenced the affluenza teen, and noticed that she decided not to run for re-election. I think she read the writing on the wall and saw people would not re-elect her after the type of publicity that case got. And so this is, again, a mechanism where even judges get a lot of accountability from the general public on make good choices, make right decisions. It also runs into problems. Again, where I live, there have been some, again, I'll just say like spicy political problems related to, there's a major public official who was indicted on securities fraud before he was elected to a statewide office. And it was here in the county that I live in that he was indicted on. And it has been a massive legal drama in Collin County, where there was a district judge who essentially approved funding for private attorneys to help prosecute this case. And that caused a massive political backlash against this judge. And then he lost his seat as a judge, was basically swept out in the primary elections because of his not towing the party line on those politics. So you'll also see that happening. And again, I know I've just thrown y'all in the deep end of what goes on in local politics. And that will either overwhelm you or get you so excited and curious about what's going on in local politics. And then this last thing I wanted to highlight is some of these are actually specialty courts. These get super interesting because there are diversion programs, like for drug or mental health issues. There are courts that specialize entirely in how do we make sure people who have drug issues don't just end up in jail? How do we make sure they get treatment and, change their ways instead of being treated as some kind of like, I hate the language of like common criminal, but there's specialty courts that focus on that, or specialty courts that focus on misdemeanor DWI cases, or specialty courts that treat people arrested for prostitution who may have been trafficked. There are courts that focus entirely on that. Those get really interesting. And again, if you follow this link, you can find all about those, because the people who run for those essentially need to be specialized in that field. So within the district courts, again, you find a lot of things going on. So I'm going to go back to my list for just a moment and see again. I think the lack of comments in the chat means y'all think I'm covering everything perfectly and not that you're just super curious about anything else. Cool. I would also like to talk a little bit about some of the county positions. The county commissioners, again, it might use the language of county commissioners court, but what they do is mainly administrative. They mainly pick out like county's budget, county's tax rate, and a few other things. And then there's the county judge, who again is primarily, I think the best comparison is like the mayor of the county, but it's the county, not a city. So presiding officer over the commissioner's court. So that's another position that may be on your ballot. Again, on mine, there's not much of a race going on for county commissioner. I think Tarrant County has a pretty interesting race going on for county judge. But again, yeah, we'll just go with a yes. I tried looking up the Tarrant County sample ballots, and it wanted me to do it through the residents lookup, but I'm not registered in Tarrant County, so I couldn't be as helpful as I would like to be. But this is one that, again, keep an eye on it. Where I live, we don't have a public hospital. We have kind of a county set up healthcare system where people have to apply to get particular treatment by the county. And so this is something that the county would administer, whereas in Dallas County, they've got Parkland Hospital, which they have their own taxing district and things like that. So there's, again, local courts, county courts at law, and depending on the county you're in, there is a range of them. The Ballotpedia definition was so helpful. They were created for the counties with larger population. They were each established by an individual statute and thus vary widely in scope. So as much as I would love to give something that is applicable to everybody, if I only talked about Collin County or Dallas County or Tarrant County, what about the people who live in other counties? So again, here's resources. Find things that work for you. And then we've got more local things like Justice of the Peace. And again, depending on the county, there's different precincts. So there might be 3 or 4 precincts. And then even within that, they might have like this region is precinct 1, this region is precinct 2, this region is precinct 3, but has 3 different judges all in that same precinct. It again just varies by where you live. So that's the big picture. And again, if I go back to my sample ballot, I could show you on a lot of these races, there's no contested race there or no contested race there. So the advice that I give to people whenever they're trying to figure out who are all these positions, again, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, and I know that's hard, but you don't have to learn everything at the same time. And so for some of these, again, I just have to I don't have to think about that one. Instead, I identify 2 or 3 positions each cycle. So at this point, I've been caring about local politics for a long time, and I could talk about, most of these positions. And then depending on where you live, there can always be interesting things going on. One of the fun things on the particular sample ballot I've been scrolling through here, there's actually 3 different husband and wife pairs on the sample ballot that for the county where I live, complete with district clerk and then her husband running for county judge. So that's one of those things where you're just like, what interesting things are going on in local politics. So that's a great question. If you don't know about a specific race, am I required to cast a vote for that position? No, you don't have to vote for every single position. One of these things, like this is a personal choice. I don't even bother checking a box if a race is not contested. There are other times where I look at the options and I think, both of those are good. And so I don't cast a vote on that one. There are times I look at the options and I think both of those are terrible, and I don't cast a vote on that one. So you don't have to vote for everything. It is okay if you have a strong opinion only about governor and you're like, I would like to vote for one person in particular. You can do just that one, whoever that is, and then finish voting. Or you could spend time looking at a few other options on there. One of the things I do want to highlight is I've mentioned the runoffs a few times. Whatever primary you vote in. So if you vote in the Democratic primary, you can vote in the Democratic runoff, but not the Republican runoff. Or if you vote in the Republican primary, you can vote in the Republican runoff, not the Democratic runoff. You can't cross the streams. You can't vote in the Democratic primary and Republican runoff. So that's one of those things that, again, depending on where you live, you might be thinking in terms of which runoff do I want to care about. If you don't vote in either primary, you can vote in one of the runoffs. So you might just say, I am overwhelmed, I don't know what to do, I'll wait until there's a runoff. That's an option. Or if you're interested in third-party politics, skip the runoffs, contact your third party in the area. It's one of those things that, engaging in democracy, it's our right. It is a big deal. We're not going to hunt you down if you don't. You got to do what works for your particular convictions. So I think I covered some of that in the primaries. I did want to say a few more times, ballot fatigue is this experience of there are so many things on my ballot. Where do I start? That's the term, ballot fatigue. And it's, again, I don't want to be like, oh, you're just going to be fatigued, don't even try. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean is give yourself space for that. I like splitting the load with a couple of other friends. Sometimes I think I don't understand this position at all, but I have a friend who has similar values to me. I'll ask her her thoughts on something. I also love the engagement with advocacy groups. So there are various issues that I care about, and I will look for groups that share my values and say, which candidates do they support? Which ones do they endorse? And that can be helpful for taking some of that load off. And then don't expect perfection. There are some times that I think about, why did I vote for that person? But I made the best choice I could at the time. Then the last couple of things here, let's see. If you haven't registered to vote, you can't vote in this coming election, but register as soon as you can. Make sure you're registered. And then find where your polling place is. There's great resources online. Depending on where you live, you might have to make sure you find a specific location. And then when you go vote, sadly, you can't bring your phone in with you. There are concerns that people could take pictures, like take videos of who they're voting for. There's a lot of debate of like, is that actually a real concern? Whatever it is, you bring paper instead. So what I do is print off my sample ballots, decide who I'm voting for, go equipped with that. When you go vote, you need your state ID, state issued ID. College ID probably isn't good enough. Please do not wear overtly political clothing. I have seen election judges tell people, get out, turn your shirt inside out. You cannot come in here wearing that particular shirt. So again, don't bring your phone. Now, you might have been mailed a card like this that has your voter information, and this is useful, but they could probably find everything they need with just your ID. So don't worry about bringing this card. If you have it, great. I'll just walk in and give them both, but they probably only need this. So if you can't find this, don't worry about it. So that's the highlights. Early voting wraps up today, I believe. So I'm actually going to go vote this afternoon. And then we have election day on Tuesday. So that's all I've got. Are there any other questions or comments in the chat, or anybody else who wants to pop in? Let me unpin myself. I'm going to drop my slideshow in the chat one more time as well. Oh, there's the attendance form. That's a good one. So thank you for coming. You should have a form like that somewhere in the chat. I feel like I need some good hold music for waiting for comments to pop up. Oh, I will take all the praise I can take. And again, I know I covered a ton of information, and I didn't even cover everything on my slides, but I've dropped that link in the chat if anybody wants to use that as a resource. So one of the things about early voting versus election day, I will tell you, one reason that people like waiting until election day is that, especially on big races like federal or statewide races, sometimes people drop out before election day. And so, early voting starts and the candidate's like burned out. And so sometimes you want to wait. I will say there is Easter egg. This is a terrible Easter egg. But on my sample ballot, there's actually a person who died in a car accident earlier this month. And so you don't generally want to use your vote on a person who has died. And so waiting until election day can be a good thing. But election day that's when like it's the last chance. And so if an emergency comes up, you have a flat tire, you get called into work, like stuff happens. And so you might miss your chance to vote. There could be longer lines. So I prefer voting towards the end of early voting. That gives me the most time to research my options, the most time for people to drop out or do terrible things that make me think, yeah, I don't want to vote for that person. But early voting, you are less likely to have long lines. So I hope that covers that. Cool. I can go back to our Texas courts flowchart. Oh, here's a question for my Tarrant County friends. Do they have a tracker online for wait times in early voting? Oh, y'all wish they did. Sorry, I might be spoiled. Like, yeah, I keep saying like, yeah, sorry, I live in Collin County still. But I get this like estimated wait time, and I think Dallas County does this too. So this one's just like, oh, that was the Frisco runoff. Yeah, it is a useful thing to have. Yeah, let's see if I can find it for other counties. Some election days, like that's my idea of fun thing to keep up on is who has wait times. Last year during the presidential election, during early voting, I just kept looking at different counties, you know, which locations have a long wait, which ones don't. Yeah, I found the longer one for Collin County. Here's our early voting location and like county-wide. And again, this don't help y'all because you don't live over here. But again, you see the green light at all of them. Sometimes they're like 40+ minute wait times, red light on it. Oh. The other thing that's happened with that is because the people working the elections have to actually call in and say what the wait time is so that they can update it at the county. So if there's a lot more voting locations, that is just an administrative mess for them. Oh, okay. So you, last election cycle, this one was way off for y'all in Tarrant County. Oh yeah, that is an interesting, like, long wait time supposedly at South Lake Town Hall. Oh, and it shows when they updated it. See, that's cool. Now that really only helps you if you have several near you. Cool. So is there anything else I can answer for y'all before we officially stop the recording and say good job all? I appreciate comments and questions in the chat. Oh, can we vote at any poll location on election day, or do we have to go to our designated site? I might need to defer to a Tarrant County person on that one, because where I live, you can vote anywhere, all county, all election times, both early voting and election day. That's a vote center model. I don't know if Tarrant County has done that yet. I'm looking at our Tarrant County website. You have to, Joan says you have to go to your precinct on election day. So on the Tarrant County voter lookup, and I'll drop that in the chat as well, you can look that up, find your registration, polling location, and sample ballot. And again, I'm sorry that I'm not prepared for some of those questions, but because I'm not a Tarrant County resident at this point, I couldn't look up on the Tarrant County website. But it does that, look up by last name, all of that stuff. But I'm not going to be in there. Looks like there's a ton of places to vote. That's cool, though. It is interesting to me just how much some of these voting policies have changed over the past few decades. And again, I'm clearly, younger, but I still remember, as a kid, we still use the punch style ballots where you have to make sure it's punched all the way through. And those of us who remember the 2000 election, and we still shudder at the term hanging Chad, and how much changes there were in federal regulations and expectations on elections in the early 2000s. And now there's this shift to online, or not online, but electronic systems. Where I live, we use this really cool hybrid system where you vote and it prints out your ballot and you visually inspect it and you make sure it says the right things, and then you feed it into a different machine. So you see who you voted for, and there's a paper backup. So that's a really cool system. But each county has to figure out what works for them. Oh yeah, so another benefit to early voting is that you can go to any polling location during early voting. Yeah. That's one of those things, again, hanging Chad, for those of y'all who don't remember it, just please get lost in Google reading about the nightmares of hanging Chad. So Tarrant County also has the system where you print it out. That's cool. Yeah, but it's interesting when there's sometimes movements to go back to a fully paper system, and we're like, oh no, you had problems trying to mark on paper, the Scantron nightmares of what's completely bubbled. Is it pushed all the way through if there are stray marks on the page? And then there's all kinds of issues in ballot design, of the infamous butterfly ballot, of people accidentally voting for the same position twice because it was split across two different pages. There's so many interesting things in electoral history. So it's just, fun times in elections. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'm gonna pop myself off the video for now. Thank y'all for participating. And